And welcome to um, the start of course, or we're in the middle of the third week of coursework. You guys have moved through week 1 and week 2, and we are now in week 3. Week 1 really was about local color realism and realism in general. Week 2 touched on mainstream realism and African American realism. And week 3 is going to focus on naturalism, which is a bit of an evolution or a divergence from realism, and of course, African American literature. If you take a look at week 3, you will see that there's a podcast on Kate Chopin, and then, of course, there are some readings and responses to do. Many of you have become very comfortable with taking a look at the information that's given you here in the overview and using that in your discussion postings. This is a great way to do that. In fact, as I was going through the postings, and might I just say, these postings are like leaps and bounds stronger than the first week. You guys have learned very quickly how to engage the literature and how to put it into conversation with the ideas that we are exploring and, of course, critiquing. You don't have to buy these ideas wholesale. You can think about how we're defining realism, how we're defining local color realism, how are we defining African American realism. And I think that that is something that's really important. Jennifer mentioned that in her postings, and many of you picked up on those observations, that realism, whether it be African American or mainstream, is really experience driven. And many of you posted in response to these observations, like Brittany, that the topic of realism is really much more about not the theoretical, but really about what is actually occurring. That was a great point made by Brittany. Travis made some good observations about experience being the greatest teacher, and I love that you are really seeing that one of the major underpinnings of realism, of course, is that sense of experience driven, of this is actual or factual. Chris mentioned the notion of symbolism, in particular in the Paul Laurence Dunbar pieces. And poetry, in fact, is very much a symbol-driven or a image-driven text, and I really appreciate those observations. Megan mentioned, of course, the reading of The Passing of Grandison, which was very much a kind of the moment, and she connected it, of course, to the civil rights movement, which Emmanuel expanded a bit more into realism and to thinking about the notion of the way that language played a role in capturing the realistic portrayal of these experiences. I also saw, of course, in the posting from Hadia that this kind of exploration of Amy Kaplan's sense that realism isn't just that capturing of the experience, but instead it's really a strategy. It's a process that we use to imagine or to manage, as she mentions, threats of social change. So you can definitely see that in the readings we've done and in reference to the African American literature that really does reference a period of time where much of the social fabric was being changed and evolved and refocused. And that was a great point of view. I also saw in Richard's posting, in particular, the focus in the dialect in an antebellum sermon, I'm sorry, not serum, the notion that this dialect is something that puts you into the place. And I think that's another part of the strategy, as Kaplan has mentioned, for getting you in there. Brooklyn pulled in Henry James's observation that humanity is immense and reality has myriad forms. And so that it's not just one experience that you're capturing, but instead this universal experience that can be transmitted to others. Michael pulled in the notion that the works of fiction allow a plot to occur or to unfold. In particular, he connected this to James. Joe also touched on some of the ideas related from Henry James, the idea that writing was meant to be didactic or a way of teaching people. James also thought that it could be entertaining. It didn't have to just be kind of didactic or to teach only. It could be very much a teaching and learning experience. And Jeremy really kind of highlighted, I think, one of the key points of this unit in that mainstream and African American realism really does define where we are. In fact, many of you are probably reading or watching presentations that reference this notion of realism and that you see being developed in these readings. And I think that's a key element to discuss as far as the fabric of our cultural understanding. Caitlin did an excellent job, and I appreciate moving in to the conversation about the wonderful Tar Baby story again, because I think you will see that we don't leave these texts behind when we move to another one. And I try to encourage students to think about literature as not just something you check off a list and you're done with it, but something that becomes part of your consciousness and also becomes part of your process, and so that you can always engage a text even if you've read it many times over. Jeremy also, Harville, pulled in the reading, of course, of Henry James, and that you dreaded it at first, but then it was really pleasant because of James' style. And James is really much a rhetorician, as Theron Johnson pointed out, and also as Vonetta mentioned as far as the advice he was given. Vonetta's exploration of Paul Laurence Dunbar's Lyrics of the Lowly Life is fantastic, and I really encourage you to take a look at that, as well as taking a look at Rico's reading of the Joel Chandler Harris stories too, in reference to Dunbar. I can see that, as I mentioned in many of your postings, as in Hannah's, as in Nathan's, you really are, and Randall's too, you really are thinking about how to engage literature. I have been posting little comments in the discussion board too to kind of help to continue to develop that and to model the way that you might want to respond. The notion that discussion boards can be boring or dull is something that I would like to disabuse and really think about how we can engage in these kind of conversations. So I encourage you, much like Rico was doing and much like many of you were doing when you were engaging in conversation, to move beyond just, I liked what you said, to really thinking about what kind of concerns or issues that you have. As in Ahmed did when he mentioned this idea that Russell had kind of focused on this story and this idea that men going out on a limb. And I think that is something that he picked up from Russell's posting, and it's a good conversation. And then, of course, Kaylin pulled in the agreement with Henry James and this realism of as being an expression of everyday life. And so I really think that these are great points of view. And as you can see here, I've also pulled in some observations for you too. As you are doing Unit 3, please make sure that you review the work and the podcast and, of course, the readings. I think many of you will enjoy the yellow wallpaper and why I wrote the yellow wallpaper. Stephen Crane's The Open Boat is a slightly larger piece. It is a novella, so it's very much a fully developed story. And both Washington and Du Bois are from two sides of the debate on African American education and position in the social realm. You will see in Washington a very concentrated effort to develop a sense of valuable work, not so much of making a change through higher education, but making a change through the learning of, and trade and vocation. Where in Du Bois, you're going to see notions of the talented 10th and the notion that you need to rise above, and there's a group of individuals that can do this. And so it's an interesting bifurcation of what we still see happening in our culture today. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thanks so much and have a great day.